In what ways are the religions we discussed this week representative of Axial Age thought? So I think you get a really good comparison and a really good sense of the diversity of how Axial Age thinking is being developed around the world. Kind of looking at the religions we looked at last week in China and the ones we looked at this week in India. And you can really see how they have those hallmarks of sort of axial age thinking and philosophy, where it's very much focusing on the role that individual people should be playing in their lives, in society, very sort of retrospective, and really relying upon some sort of very complex philosophical ideas to explain sort of how everything fits together and how people's sort of moral and ethical decisions fit into a broader and wider sort of religious context or philosophical context. So let's get into it. So Hinduism is really focused around this idea of there being sort of an immortal soul, right? How people's souls don't die just because a body dies. So this idea that there's a part of people that are going to live on, and that soul then is going to essentially be reincarnated in some way, shape, or form. This idea of sort of a transmigration of the soul, that the soul is going to be able to be put into essentially a new vessel and live on, and that essentially it's going to kind of operate like a ladder. There's kind of like this reincarnation ladder where if you do everything correctly and behave correctly in one life, you'll be essentially reincarnated as something higher up sort of on this reincarnation ladder. And in this way, it very much supports the caste system, right? This idea that essentially everyone in India was born into a particular caste, meaning sort of a particular level of society, and that's essentially where they are placed is based upon, in theory of Hinduism, what their actions in a previous life had been. And it's possible that there could be, animals involved with this, or other trees or spirits, or other things that have souls could be part of this as well. But that sort of by fulfilling whatever your role is in society or in the world, that gives you something called good dharma. Dharma essentially means fulfilling your role or fulfilling your task, whether it's your task in the caste system or whether it's sort of your task in the world. And that by successfully fulfilling your dharma, you get good karma. So if you're part of the warrior caste, it's your dharma to go out and essentially engage in wars and warfare. That's what you should be doing. That's your role in society. If you're a Brahmin, you should be studying religion and Hinduism and preaching to the people. That should be essentially your job, and that is your dharma. And by successfully fulfilling your dharma, then you get good karma, and it's by getting that good karma that you're able to sort of move up on this reincarnation ladder. Essentially, you'll be reincarnated into a higher caste or into a higher level of society than you were before. Ultimately, the main goal of Hinduism is to sort of break free from this cycle of reincarnation and eventually sort of join what they call the Brahman, or the sort of universal soul, and that only people who have moved to sort of the very top layer of this reincarnation ladder are going to have an opportunity to try to do that. But it's very much based around, once more, looking at society and trying to come up with a theological system that makes sure everyone in society is sort of doing their role and doing their part. We saw how Confucianism sort of dealt with this last week as far as sort of promoting those sages or those sort of good role models for society, and having a sort of very well-educated class of people that could serve as good examples for others. This was sort of the Indian model of trying to also replicate that emphasis on a regulated, stable society. Jainism really is another religion that forms in India, and the very earliest sort of Jain scholars and followers would have essentially been breaking off from Hinduism, or an off-growth from Hinduism. And some of that same idea of sort of everything having a soul, it becomes very important to Jainism. But where Jainism sort of takes it to another direction was this idea of sort of absolute nonviolence, and that because everything has a soul, you should sort of live, or essentially live your life trying not to harm anything, because sort of the destruction of something that has a soul is kind of the worst thing you could possibly do. So that if you were going to be a warrior in battle, that'd be an absolute terrible thing because you'd have to be hurting or destroying someone. If you were going to be working in agriculture and slaughtering animals, once more, you wouldn't be able to do that. And a lot of Jains take it to sort of extremes by covering their mouths to make sure that they don't breathe in insects, or sweeping the ground in front of them as they walk to make sure they don't crush any insects that are there. So going to sort of extreme lengths to make sure that they're not going to be hurting any living being. Also, a big part of Jainism is this idea of sort of an aesthetic lifestyle, meaning that they own very little possessions. They essentially just rely upon gifts from the people around them to sort of survive. So they don't have really a whole lot of possessions. And essentially try to live a very simple lifestyle without having too many things, or too many outside attachments. That's also sort of part of the idea of what makes a good Jainist, is having sort of a very simple life that is primarily based around meditation and once more that sort of complete adherence to nonviolence. Buddhism is another outgrowth of Hinduism, and is sort of, in a lot of ways, you can kind of see it as a middle ground between Hinduism and Jainism. Buddhism, of course, is started by Siddhartha Gautama, who is sort of this wealthy prince. He grows up very isolated, but when he's exposed to the world, he sees the suffering that is then sort of inherent in the world. Leaves his sort of life in his palace behind, leaves his family, and decides that he needs to sort of figure out the truths of the world. How is it that sort of he can have life so good, and other people are instead sort of curse of sickness and dying, and how can someone sort of find happiness in this setting? And this is sort of coming to a part where, the same time period that Jainism is being formed, and there were a lot of sort of holy people in Hinduism who were questioning the religion, and they were going off into the wilderness, and they were meditating, and they were practicing that asceticism, like starving themselves. The founder of Jainism, actually, in legends, essentially starved themselves to death because they were sort of so committed to to sort of living an austere lifestyle that even eating was a luxury that he didn't felt that he deserved. So Buddha goes out and he meditates and he tries some of these techniques, and essentially through that period has a revelation, which he comes back and begins sharing with a number of followers. And essentially, you can think of this revelation as trying to follow the middle path, this path between sort of the extreme devotion to one's caste in Hinduism, and this idea of dharma and karma, as opposed to this idea of sort of completely removing yourself from kind of society and the ascetic lifestyle of Jainism. The middle path is trying to find a common ground between the two, and the common ground that he finds is essentially this: the Four Noble Truths are sort of the beginning to it, and that is essentially that life is full of suffering. That's sort of the revelation that he saw before he left his luxurious lifestyle, and he comes to the conclusion that suffering stems from attachment or desire. So wanting things in life is what causes us suffering, and that one then has to try to stop that attachment or that desire in order to stop the suffering, and that the best way to do that is something that he called the Noble Eightfold Path. So following this path was supposed to lead to the rejection of that attachment. But the important part is through that sort of Eightfold Path, the conclusion he comes to is that the best way to stop attachment and desire isn't to completely give everything up, right? That's the idea of asceticism that Jainism sort of preached, that the best way to stop desiring was never to own or acquire any attachments in the first place. Buddhism essentially argues that no, that's not quite correct, that there needs to be sort of a middle path that you need to walk. So sort of the correct views, the correct speech, the correct actions, trying to do all these various things in a more sort of moderate style. And the ultimate goal then of Buddhism, rather than trying to sort of break free from this reincarnation ring, and join the universal soul was trying to instead just sort of get your soul to a place where it would sort of achieve ultimate wisdom and compassion, which he called reaching nirvana. And that the best way to do this was sort of following that middle path. So it didn't mean giving everything up, but it also meant not getting too attached to those things in your life, and not letting desire sort of dictate your actions or your thoughts or your deeds. So you can still have a family, you can still have possessions, you can still enjoy life, but you can't overindulge. Instead, you sort of have to find that sort of middle ground. So you can see some of those same ideas, if you remember back, sort of reminiscent of some of those Taoist ideas of that sort of middle ground that you should be seeking. And once more, this is going to be a theme you're going to be seeing repeated in many of these axial age beliefs. This idea of sort of a more moderate take to life is going to be the correct vision. But of course, there's other belief systems that are going to be saying that pushing more one way or the other. So these are just some of the ways that you see these three different belief systems fitting in with axial age thought. As you can see, they're all very much focused on individuals' behaviors and how they're fitting in with the sort of universe around them to a very large degree. All right, looking at the drawings and symbols that people created, yeah, I thought that the class did a good job coming up with some pretty unique ideas on how to represent these various ideas in a visual format. For Hinduism, I saw some people focusing on the ideas of those sort of castes, or the main classes, the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, and the Sudras, the warriors, the priests, and the laborers, and trying to make that sort of being a big symbol of Hinduism, since sort of fulfilling your role within that sort of caste structure was supposed to give you the sort of good dharma you needed in order to increase your karma. I saw someone use the infinity symbol as an idea of kind of an immortal soul and the process of death and rebirth, which I thought was pretty interesting. Someone else had the idea of sort of a breaking of a chain, that idea of sort of breaking free from this cycle and trying to become one with that universal soul. So I thought that was a very good visual depiction. For Jainism, I saw someone use sort of a tree to symbolize the idea that sort of every natural thing has a soul to some degree, and sort of how at peace with the universe and with nature that Jains are supposed to be. A few people used the peace symbol, once more that idea of kind of ultimate peacefulness and non-aggression and non-violence that the Jains ascribe to. Someone else pictured one of the brooms, sort of the idea of the brooms that they use to sweep in front of them as they walk, is a good symbol of Jainism, which I thought was pretty clever. Under Buddhism, if you had people depict the Buddha himself, of course, unlike Hinduism and Jainism, where sort of the founding figure, there really isn't one for Hinduism, and for Jainism, that figure's a little bit more obscured in sort of history, whereas Siddhartha Gautama is sort of a much more sort of historical figure that you can point to, and plays sort of a very prominent role within the religion, where he sort of, in some certain sects of Buddhism, sort of worshipped himself as almost a prophet or a deity. So using Buddha as a symbol for Buddhism in general, I thought was pretty in line with sort of some of those ways that Buddhism is conceptualized. Someone used a spider to represent it, primarily because of the 8 legs and sort of the 8 noble truths, and also, I'm sorry, the 4 noble truths, the eightfold path. Eightfold path, of course, is what I'm trying to say there. Someone else depicted a monastery for Buddhism. Of course, Buddhism is going to be one of the first religions with that really strong monastic component, where followers of Buddhism are supposed to sort of gather together in separated, isolated congregations for meditation and reflection on sort of the main tenets of Buddhism. So another good depiction there of sort of one of the key tenets of what's eventually going to come to define Buddhism. Alright, so this question was asking you to choose one of the religions we talked about in Axial Age, India, and compare it to one of the religions or philosophies we talked about with Axial Age, China, and comparing and contrasting them. I've already gone into a lot of detail last week and this week on the exact details of those religions, so I'm not going to go through sort of every pairing that you could find, but I thought the class did a very good job in provide some very interesting answers here, doing these comparisons. I mean, comparing something like legalism with Jainism, and sort of just how absolutely different they were in most respects, but seeing that there was sort of this very detailed thought process in the construction of each of those philosophies was very interesting. Some people found a lot of commonalities between the two, whether it was comparing Hinduism and Confucianism and sort of their emphasis on creating a stable society and a governmental or ruling structure that is sort of easy to implement and maintain. Some people took the natural elements of Taoism and compared them to both Buddhism and Jainism, and how sort of this knowledge of the natural world becomes very important to just knowledge of and a respect for in a lot of ways. Kind of the natural world becomes very important to those religions. So yeah, I thought the class did a very good job with this question, and you can really see how there are a lot of similarities and difference presence in all these various sort of philosophies, but that in different ways sort of fulfilled the intellectual and spiritual needs of the people who were following them to varying degrees. Describe India's caste system. What were the pros and cons of such a philosophy and social structure? So very early on, you see that the Indian caste system isn't terribly different from a lot of the other social stratification systems we've seen in other civilizations. That generally the society was broken between three main groups: the warriors, and the princes, and sort of the secular rulers, the Brahmins, the priests, the holy men. And the Sudras, essentially sort of everyone else, the laborers, the majority of the population who are going to be supporting those other two castes. As time goes on, however, there become more and more castes, and people are more and more sort of assigned into a specific and particular role within society. This role in society would typically determine sort of what you did, what your job or your function in society would be, who you can marry, what kind of foods you could eat, who you could socialize with. And of course, this caste system becomes very much backed up by the religion of Hinduism, that the entire sort of moral purpose of a good Hindu is to stay in their caste and fulfill their duties within their caste. And if you do that, you will essentially be rewarded. And if you don't do that, you will then be punished. So trying to make sure that society is very much built in a way that there's kind of a place for everyone, and everyone is kept in their place, if you want to think about it in that way. So what are some of the pros and cons to this caste system? Well, to a large degree, just like we saw with Confucianism, it's going to lead to a certain degree of stability within society, because there's a place for everyone, and everyone in theory should be kept in their place. Everyone essentially knows their role. There's very little sort of existential crisis going on about what people want to do with their lives, right? Like, from the day you're born, you're essentially determined sort of what your role and your goal and your purpose should be. So in the caste system, there's not a lot of people sitting there scratching their heads trying to figure out what major they want to go after in college or something like that. There aren't these sort of big hard choices and decisions that they need to make in their life. Everything's sort of already been determined for them. Also, with this kind of a system, you sort of have a built-in social and support network. People within your caste are supposed to be the primary people who you're friends with. They're your relatives. They're going to be the people who you lean on if you need help. If someone dies and there's a widow and her children who need to be supported, they're going to be receiving that kind of social support from people within their own caste. So it does provide a certain amount of assistance to those people who need it, and emotional and companionship and so forth, within a society, that people don't need to kind of go out and need to try to find and discover those networks for themselves. They're already essentially provided for everyone who's born into this system. So what are the cons of the caste system? Well, as you can imagine, because everything is so predetermined, there's very little personal freedom. A lot of your choices are very much sort of whittled down to within a very particular set. And certainly, this can be a problem if a person is just not very well suited for the caste that they are in. If a person is supposed to be a warrior and just is not a very good warrior or does not like to be forced to constantly be fighting and things like that, that could be a problem. If someone might be a really good poet or writer, or a really good thinker, but their main job is to clean the streets at night, there's going to be very little impact that they're going to be able to have on society. And in this system, there's really no way of upward mobility. You are always going to be in the caste that you were born into. And that certainly is going to make it so that there's very little chance to move between any of the social structures or social ranks within this society. And as it really kind of depends on the point of view that you're looking at it. And certainly someone who's on the top of society is going to say that this works very well for them. But you can certainly take a very cynical look at the caste system in Hinduism as well, and sort of look at it as a philosophy and a religion that's really just put in place as a justification for those people at the top of society to stay at the top. And to more or less force those at the bottom of society to not question their role, right? The entire idea being we're at the top of society because of all the good things we have done in previous lives, so this is kind of our reward. And if you're at the bottom of society, well, you're there because obviously you haven't been fulfilling your, jobs very well, and you haven't been acting in the right way. But if you act really good this time and don't make any waves and stay in your caste and know your role, well, then maybe in the next life, then you can move up in that idea of social mobility. Now, coming from a mindset of an outsider where, if we don't buy into that idea of reincarnation, yeah, that seems like that could be a very manipulative and controlling aspect. But if you're inside of it and really firmly believe that there is social mobility in the fact that your soul is going to be resurrected into a higher caste, it is going to cause a certain degree of peace and tranquility for people engaged in this, even if they aren't having the sort of best role in society or the one that they necessarily care for the most. It'll give them at least some sort of hope and something to keep driving for, in potentially their next iteration of life. So yeah, I mean, you can look at it in a number of different ways depending on sort of the belief system that you're choosing to employ. But certainly, it's going to be a system that is very much going to be intended to make sure that any kind of social revolutions or social upheavals are going to be very difficult to obtain, and that's one of the reasons why the caste system was embedded in Indian culture and society for thousands of years. And it's really only been until the 20th century that there's started to be some sort of pushback and questioning of that. But even still today, it's a very big and prevalent part of Indian culture and society, and they still haven't completely broken free from it, even though it's to a certain degree been written out of their legal systems and governing systems and so forth. Why do you think China was able to continually organize itself into large imperial states while such long-standing empires seldom developed in India? And this is kind of a tough question. On the surface, you look at China and India, and they have a lot of the same elements and components, right? That they had large populations, that they were very diverse, that they had some natural barriers that sort of gave them isolation from outside invading elements and peoples. But continually, China seemed to organize itself into a larger imperial structure, while India was much more decentralized and defined much more by sort of competing smaller kingdoms and states and so forth, despite things like the Mauryan dynasty and so forth that are going to have larger imperial rule for a certain amount of time. That becomes more of an aberration rather than the norm within India. So what was behind this? And I thought the class did a good job of bringing up a lot of potential ideas on what could have led to these differences. I think just looking back at the early history of both of these locations, both of them set sort of a precedent very early on after the development of agriculture and organizing themselves into larger population groups and sizes. We see the development in China with the Zhao dynasty very early on. That they developed a strong centralized government and a history of supporting some sort of centralized imperial structure. You also have things like the mandate of heaven, concepts that are developed within China that meant that even when an empire was going to fall, that it was kind of the expectation that a new imperial system or a new dynasty was going to be taking its place, that someone else would, one sort of single person or dynasty would inherit that mantle, and it wouldn't be split up between a whole bunch of different provinces. The mandate of heaven was supposed to pass to sort of one particular new ruling entity to take up that, so that passing sort of that imperial power from one dynasty to the next becomes kind of an expectation. And as time goes on, then, and you enter in sort of that philosophy and those ideas of Confucianism, that idea of just having that large, educated, bureaucratic Mandarin class to keep kind of the imperial structure flowing and running, even between dynasties, means that it's going to be sort of cemented for the long haul in a lot of ways. India, for the large part, is not going to have that. If you're looking back to the Harappans, we saw that there was a lot of decentralization. Remember, it's hard to even determine if they had like a kingship model. It seemed like the towns of the Indus River Valley might have been run by councils or so forth, that there wasn't kind of the typical hallmarks of kingship that we see. Once the Aryans come into the picture, they of course are a much more sort of tribal group, and are comprised of a lot of times just sort of Aryan leaders competing against one another. So once more, there's not this idea of sort of one centralized state, and it's not really until you get to the Mauryan dynasty or empire that you have a consolidated empire, which is much later in their history than what you saw with China. So there's this much longer history of decentralization within India than you had with China. Also, the main sort of ideological framework of Hinduism, to a large degree, doesn't really take into an idea of any kind of centralization of government within the Indian people in general. It's kind of everyone just in their location doing the role in the caste that they were assigned to, and kind of your identification with a caste becomes much more important than any kind of broader identification with a country or a kingdom or a province. Your main allegiance and your main focus is going to typically be on that caste level. And even at the top caste, the kings and the princes and then the warriors, their main job is to rule things, but also to kind of compete with each other, right? Like if you're a warrior, you need to find someone to go out and fight with, and quite typically that's just going to be other Hindu kingdoms or princes around you. So there was never really an ideological mandate to solidify into one state. I mean, I don't think it's an accident that the first real centralized empire in India is actually a Buddhist empire, not a Hindu empire. And that it was sort of a Buddhist ideology that was behind that conglomeration. So I think that there's a lot of things you can look at, and it's hard to pin down maybe one exact reason, but just the way that the societies were constructed from sort of the very early Neolithic times, you can see that there's differences in the centralization that was common or desired in both locations. Okay, let's dig into our document exercises here. So lots of really good quotes that you could have pulled from all of these documents to sort of show how they best kind of exemplify the various religions. So I'll once more be sort of picking out some of the key ones that people brought up and that I thought you should be aware of. So looking at the first document, the Hindu document. Now, it's important to know a little bit the context behind this. Some people were able to tease it out from the document. I felt some people had a little bit of trouble with it. So Arjuna is the hero, and his chariot is pulled up between sort of two large armies, both of which are his relatives. Essentially, he's in the middle of a civil war, and he has relatives who are fighting on both sides of this civil war. And he is very conflicted because he doesn't want to have to kill essentially his family members and his relatives in this war. Krishna, the god who he is talking to, is essentially going to be telling him why he should fight and why he needs to fight. So this isn't a document about pacifism or not fighting. This is actually a document where the gods are telling Arjuna why he should be engaging in this war and in this battle. So Arjuna says at one point, "Although they would kill me, I wish not to fight them. No, not even for the dominion of the 30 regions of the universe, much less for this little earth." So that's he goes on for more, but sort of that's a good depiction of him saying, "I don't want to have to fight in this. That the guilt and the pain I would feel from killing people who I am friends with or relatives with would not essentially be worth." Sort of the conquest of this little earth, as he puts it. Krishna then is going to lay out why, in fact, he should not feel bad about killing his relatives or people he is friends with, and that instead it's a very good thing for him to be doing this. So Krishna goes on, "Those who are wise in spiritual things grieve neither for the dead nor for the living. I myself never was not, nor thou, nor all the princes of the earth, nor shall we ever hereafter cease to be." So once more, this is this idea of the immortal soul, right? That no one has ever not been, that everyone is eternal, and because just someone's sort of current body dies, that's no reason to be sad for that. That's not a bad thing. Essentially, this is Arjuna's or Krishna saying that death is not something to mourn. He goes on, "There is no existence for that which does not exist, nor is there any non-existence for what exists." So once more, no one actually ever dies is kind of the message he's putting out here. "The man who believeth that that it is this spirit which killeth, and he who thinketh that it may be destroyed, are both alike deceived, for it neither killeth nor is it killed." So once more, you're not actually, just because you're killing someone in this estimation, you're not actually killing them. And that's once more, he's trying to make this argument. This is why you shouldn't feel bad about killing these people that you're going to be fighting against in this battle. "Death is certain to all things which are born, and rebirth to all mortals. Therefore it doth not behoove thee to grieve about the inevitable." Kind of saying everyone's going to die eventually anyways, or not die, but leave their sort of current mortal shell and be reincarnated. So once more, there's no reason to grieve about that. Then he doubles down, not really double down, but then he explains why it is Arjuna's duty, in fact, to fight. So first of all, don't feel bad about the people you're going to have to kill. Second of all, it's your job to do so. "A soldier of the Kshatriya tribe hath no duty superior to lawful war, and just to thy wish the door of heaven is found open before thee." So saying that it's his job as a part of the Kshatriya tribe, as part of his caste, a warrior caste, to engage in this lawful war. And so kind of going through and saying that it's his job or his obligation and duty to do this, he then goes on to say what will happen if he does not perform his function. "But if thou wilt not perform the duty of thy calling and fight out the field, thou wilt abandon thy natural duty, and thy honor will be guilty of a crime." So once more saying that the worst thing that Arjuna could do here is not fight in the battle. That would be giving up his honor, and he'd be guilty of a crime. That the moral thing to do is to engage and fight in this battle. And I like the sort of last bit he puts in here, because essentially that Krishna, after all this explanation, you shouldn't feel bad about it. No one's actually dying. It's your job to do this, and it's morally correct. He then sort of uses like a peer pressure on Arjuna, that what will everyone else, all your friends and everyone think if you don't fight? So he says, "The generals and the armies will think that thy retreat from the field arose from fear, or even amongst those by whom thou went, wont to be thought great of soul, thou shalt become despicable." Thine enemies will speak of thee in words which are unworthy to be spoken, deprecating thy courage and abilities, and what can be more dreadful than this? Yeah, so saying that if you do run away, all your friends are going to laugh at you. Your enemies are going to think you're a chicken. The only thing that you can do to save face is to get out there and fulfill your duty and job as a warrior. So you can really sort of see how this is breaking down that thought process of Hinduism, that there's an immortal soul, no one actually dies. Your main job or purpose in the world is to fulfill your duty, and if you fail to do your duty, it's a crime, and you are going to essentially be despised for not having fulfilled that caste duty. So yeah, a good kind of breakdown of those core fundamental beliefs of Hinduism here from the god Krishna himself. All right, let's go on to the second document then, looking at the Jainist document. So the Jainist document here is just sort of going through all the various ways that life exists, essentially, and saying why human beings should not harm them. It begins with the earth, and it goes through kind of the elements: earth, fire, wind, and so forth. So one quote that sort of shows this is, injury to the earth is like striking, cutting, maiming, or killing a blind man. Knowing this man should not sin against earth or cause or permit others to do so. So trying to say that people should not be sinning against the earth, they should not be striking it or cutting it or maiming it, and that doing it or allowing others to do so is a sin. He who injures the lives and water does not understand the nature of sin or renounces it. So once more, bringing water in is another element that you should not be sinning against. And there's a lot of examples from the other elements here that I'm not going to be going into. But then it gives some more justification or reason for this. And just as in the nature of a man to be born and grow old, so is it the nature of a plant to be born and grow old. One is endowed with reason, and so is the other. One is sick, if injured, and so is the other. One grows larger, and so does the other. One changes with time, and so does the other. He who understands the nature of sin against plants is called a true sage who understands karma. So essentially saying here that plants are the exact same as people and humans, that they grow the same. It says that they're endowed with the same reason. If they're injured, they feel the same pain. They change over time. It's trying to say that people and plants are essentially the exact same and should be treated the exact same. And this is sort of reiterated in the next quote here. All beings with 2, 3, 4, or 5 senses, in fact all creation, know individually pleasure and displeasure, pain, terror, and sorrow. So once more, trying to say that everything in the world that has a soul feels, is capable of feeling these sort of same sensations. In short, he who understands the nature of sin in respect to all of the 6 types of living beings is called a true sage who understands karma. So this is a very good breakdown here of that idea of Jainism, that everything is alive, everything has a soul, everything feels pain, and that there's really no sort of level in different layers in beings. You need to treat all beings, all living things, with an equal amount of care and respect, and that's the person who sort of is a sage, a true sage, and he who sort of understands karma understands this reasoning. All right, moving on to the Buddhist document. And this document essentially is created once the Buddha immediately returns from that period where he was isolating himself in the wilderness, where he was starving himself and deprecating sort of all the worldly pleasures, and doing this sort of intense meditation. And this was kind of the idea of what a holy man should be at this point in time. Someone who goes off, gives up all their possessions. It's kind of what the Jains were doing. Does not eat a lot of food or almost starves themselves, and that this is what a holy person should be. And you can see that when he comes back, the people who confront the Buddha are kind of mocking him or saying that he's not a true sage. They say, he has broken his vow and has abandoned holiness. He is no bhikkhu. But Gautama has become a man who lives in abundance and indulges in the pleasures of worldliness. So once more, this is seen as being unholy, right? Someone who partakes in worldly pleasures was someone who was not a real holy man according to them. And this is really what Buddha is pushing back against in this document, and his real sort of argument for the middle path comes to bear. He says, the Tathagata, the Buddha continued, does not seek Tathagata, essentially meaning sort of the enlightened, an enlightened person or an enlightened sage, does not seek salvation in austerities, but neither does he, for that reason, indulge in worldly pleasures, nor live in abundance. The Tathagata has found the middle path. And once more, that is sort of his key here, that it should be a middle path between giving everything up and abundance. He goes on to explain this in more detail. There are two extremes, obikuns, which the man who has given up the world ought not to follow the habitual practice, on the one hand, of self-indulgence, which is unworthy, vain, and fit only for the worldly-minded, and the habitual practice, on the other hand, of self-mortification, meaning harming yourself, which is pain, useless, and unprofitable. So once more, saying that there's this middle path between mortification and hurting yourself and inflicting pain upon yourself, and being vain and selfish and indulgent. The path which opens the eyes and bestows understanding, which leads to peace of mind and the higher wisdom, to full enlightenment, to nirvana. Once more, that ultimate goal of reaching and achieving nirvana, of achieving peace of mind, and that sort of higher wisdom is achieved through this middle path. How does one get there then? He finishes up by kind of explaining how one finds this middle path. He recognizes the existence of suffering, its cause, its remedy, and its cessation, has fathomed the Four Noble Truths. He will walk in the right path. So once more, acknowledging the Four Noble Truths, that idea of the existence of suffering that is caused by that sort of attachment to worldly desires, and its remedy then is to follow those eightfold path. Which he then goes on to explain in the next paragraph. Right views will be the torch to light his way. Right aspirations will be his guide. Right speech will be his dwelling place on the road. Phil's gait will be straight, for it is his right behavior. His refreshments will be the right way of earning his livelihood. Right efforts will be his steps. Right thoughts his breath. And the right contemplation will give him peace that follows in his footprints. So once more, in order to recognize and achieve this middle ground, you need to sort of go through this eightfold path in order to achieve that. So very much sort of listing here his conceptualization of why he sort of chose to move to the middle path. The middle path, of course, is going to be the best way to achieve that higher wisdom and nirvana. And in order to reach that, you need to acknowledge the Four Noble Truths and follow then the eightfold path. So hopefully these quotes sort of helped you sort of conceptualize and see where we finished up.